There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that the person sitting next to you at a dinner party, the neighbor who waves from across the fence, or the coworker who brings donuts on Fridays could be capable of something unthinkable. Tonight, we're going to explore the stories of people who appeared perfectly ordinary, even admirable, right up until the moment they weren't. These are true accounts of lives that shattered in ways no one saw coming. It was the kind of neighborhood where kids rode bikes in the street and families gathered for barbecues on summer weekends. Westfield, New Jersey, in the late 1960s, was the picture of American suburbia, the kind of town you'd see in a magazine spread about the good life, and sitting right at the heart of it, in a sprawling 19-room Victorian mansion on Hillside Avenue, was the List family. To anyone looking in from the outside, they seemed to have it all. John List was a quiet, devoutly religious man who served as a Sunday school teacher and a Boy Scout troop leader. His wife Helen had a sharp wit and a social streak, and their 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick, were typical suburban kids bouncing between school and extracurriculars. John had served as an officer in the Army during both World War II and the Korean War, had earned a master's degree in accounting, and had climbed the corporate ladder to the position of vice president and comptroller at a bank in nearby Jersey City. He was the kind of man people pointed to as a model citizen, a man of faith and discipline, the kind of father who showed up to every soccer game and never raised his voice. But behind the manicured hedges and the stained glass windows of what locals called Breeze Knoll, something was rotting. John List had been quietly drowning for years. The bank where he worked had closed its doors, and rather than tell his family he had been laid off, John got dressed in his suit every single morning, drove to the Westfield train station, and sat there for hours reading the newspaper until it was time to come home and pretend everything was normal. The mortgage payments on that enormous mansion were bleeding him dry. He was draining his elderly mother Alma's savings accounts just to keep the lights on. His wife Helen, meanwhile, was battling her own demons. She had contracted syphilis from her first husband years earlier, and the disease had gone untreated for so long that it was beginning to affect her both physically and mentally. She had become an alcoholic and had grown increasingly difficult and resentful. She reportedly told John in front of others that if he were half the man her first husband was, they wouldn't be in this mess. And then there were the children. Patricia, the eldest at 16, was becoming increasingly independent, interested in theater and drama, and showing signs of pulling away from the strict religious life her father demanded. John Jr., at 15, was reportedly experimenting with marijuana and starting to question the rigid rules of the household. Even 13-year-old Frederick, the youngest, was beginning to push back. For a man like John List, who saw the world through the narrow lens of his Lutheran faith, his family's spiritual drift felt like a catastrophe greater than any financial ruin. On the morning of November 9th, 1971, after the children left for school, John List stood in the kitchen behind his wife Helen as she drank her morning coffee. He raised a 9mm Steyr semi-automatic handgun and shot her in the back of the head. She died instantly, slumping forward at the kitchen table. He then climbed 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd-floor apartment where his 84-year-old mother Alma lived. She was still in her hallway when he shot her above the left eye. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed so heavily that he couldn't move her body. So he left her there in the hallway and pulled a carpet runner over her. He went back downstairs, dragged Helen's body into the ornate ballroom, placed her inside a sleeping bag on the floor, and mopped up the blood in the kitchen. Then he waited. When 16-year-old Patricia came home from school that afternoon, he shot her in the back of the head as she entered the house and laid her beside her mother in the ballroom. 13-year-old Frederick arrived next. Same method, same result. His body went next to his sister's. Then John List did something that still chills investigators to this day. He drove to his eldest son's school, watched John Jr. play in a soccer game, cheering from the sidelines like any proud father, and then drove the boy home. When they walked through the door together, John tried to shoot his son the same way he'd killed the others, but the gun misfired. John Jr. fought back. Father and son struggled in that grand ballroom surrounded by the cooling bodies of their family, and John List shot his eldest son approximately 10 times in the chest and face before the boy finally fell still. That night, John List sat down at the desk in his study and wrote a 5-page letter to his Lutheran pastor. In it, he explained methodically that he had killed his family to save their souls. He feared they were drifting away from God, and he believed that if they died while they were still essentially innocent, they would go to heaven. If they continued down their current path, they might be lost forever. He closed bank accounts, canceled the newspaper and milk deliveries, called the schools to say the family would be visiting a sick relative, and set every light in the house to stay on. Then he drove to John F. Kennedy International Airport, abandoned his car, and disappeared. It would be nearly a month before anyone found them. Neighbors had noticed the lights burning around the clock, but assumed the family was simply away. It was only when bulbs started burning out, one by one, leaving the grand house darker and darker, that someone finally called the police. Officers entered through an unlocked window and found the bodies arranged on the ballroom floor like a viewing at a funeral home, and organ music piped through the intercom system filled the empty rooms like a hymn from a church that no longer existed. John List vanished completely. He had prepared his escape with the same meticulous attention to detail he had applied to the killings. Before leaving, he had cut himself out of every family photograph in the house, leaving behind empty silhouettes where his face had been. He turned on the intercom system so that soft organ music played throughout the house around the clock, filling those cavernous rooms with hymns while his family lay dead below. He turned every light in the mansion on, every single one, as if the house itself were putting on a performance for the neighborhood. He traveled first to Denver, Colorado, where he assumed the identity of Robert Peter Clark. He grew a mustache, traded his formal suits for casual clothing, and took a job as a cook at a Holiday Inn. From there, he slowly rebuilt himself, working his way back into the field he knew best, accounting. He remarried a woman named Dolores, who had no idea about his past, no idea that the quiet, unassuming man she had fallen for had left 5 bodies arranged on the floor of a New Jersey ballroom. He rejoined the Lutheran Church, attended services regularly, and became the same quiet, respectable man he had always appeared to be. For nearly 18 years, he lived this double life in plain sight. Back in New Jersey, the investigation went cold almost immediately. The FBI found his car parked at John F. Kennedy International Airport, but there was no record of him boarding a flight. For a time, he was even suspected of being D.B. Cooper, the infamous skyjacker who hijacked a commercial aircraft in November 1971 and parachuted out with roughly $200,000 in cash. That theory was eventually dismissed, but it speaks to just how completely John List had erased himself. 9 months after the murders, the Breeze Knoll mansion was destroyed by arson in a fire that was never solved, and along with it went a stained glass skylight, rumored to be a signed Tiffany original, worth upwards of $100,000. It was only when the television show America's Most Wanted aired a segment about the List family murders in May of 1989 that a former neighbor of Robert Clark's recognized the profile. A forensic sculptor named Frank Bender had been commissioned to create an age-progressed bust of what John List might look like after nearly 2 decades. Bender based his sculpture on the assumption that List would still be neat and conservative, that he would have gained weight, lost most of his hair, and would probably be wearing glasses. The bust was astonishingly accurate. A woman in Denver who had known Clark saw the segment and called in the tip. 10 days after the episode aired, FBI agents arrested John List in Richmond, Virginia, where he was living quietly with Dolores. He was 63 years old and had been free for almost 18 years. Dolores was devastated, blindsided by the revelation that her husband was a wanted mass murderer. At his trial in 1990, defense lawyers argued that List suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder from his military service and was experiencing a mental breakdown at the time of the murders. Expert psychologists suggested he was going through a severe midlife crisis. The prosecution countered that a midlife crisis did not excuse the methodical execution of 5 human beings. The jury agreed. John List was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms, making him ineligible for parole for nearly 125 years. In his only public interview, conducted years later from prison, List expressed no real remorse. He said he knew what he did was wrong, even as he was doing it, but he believed that when they all got to heaven, his family would forgive him, or simply wouldn't remember. He died in prison in 2008 of pneumonia at the age of 82, still believing, by most accounts, that he would be reunited with the family he had slaughtered. And the thing about John List that still haunts people is not just what he did, but who he was. He was a Sunday school teacher, a veteran, an accountant, the kind of man you'd trust with your children, your finances, your faith. And he killed his entire family over breakfast and a soccer game, and then sat down to write a letter explaining why. Sometimes the breaking point doesn't come from a lifetime of pressure building behind a dam. Sometimes it comes from something that twists the mind from the inside out, something invisible and merciless. And by the time anyone sees it, the damage is already done. In the summer of 2001, the Yates family of Clear Lake, Texas, just outside Houston, looked like the portrait of devout family-centered living. Russell, who went by Rusty, was an engineer at the Johnson Space Center for NASA. Andrea, his wife, was a former nurse who had given up her career to raise their growing family. They had 5 children together: 7-year-old Noah, 5-year-old John, 3-year-old Paul, 2-year-old Luke, and baby Mary, who was only 6 months old. They homeschooled the children, attended church, and lived a life rooted in the belief that a mother's place was in the home and that children were blessings from God. To their neighbors and church community, Andrea was gentle and devoted. She read to her kids, sewed their clothes, and seemed to live for nothing other than being their mother. But beneath the surface, Andrea Yates was falling apart, and she had been for years. After the birth of her 4th child, Luke, in 1999, Andrea attempted to take her own life by overdosing on pills. She was hospitalized, diagnosed with severe postpartum depression and psychosis, and put on heavy antipsychotic medication, including a drug called Haldol. Her psychiatrist at the time, Dr. Eileen Starbranch, gave the family an explicit and urgent warning: do not have any more children. Another pregnancy, she said, would virtually guarantee another psychotic episode. Andrea and Rusty conceived their fifth child, Mary, approximately 7 weeks after Andrea was discharged from the hospital. After Mary was born, Andrea seemed to be managing for a while, but then her father died in March of 2001. The grief sent her spiraling. She stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped feeding the baby. She pulled out clumps of her own hair. She believed there were cameras hidden throughout her house, monitoring her every move, judging whether she was a good enough mother. She thought television commercials were speaking directly to her, calling her a bad parent. She believed that Satan himself lived inside her body, and that he was corrupting her children simply by being near them. Andrea was hospitalized again, and her doctors again prescribed Haldol. But then, just weeks before the tragedy, her new psychiatrist, Dr. Mohammed Saeed, took her off the medication. The reasons remain debated and controversial. What is not debated is what happened next. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, Rusty left for work at around 9 in the morning. His mother, Dora, was supposed to arrive about an hour later to help Andrea with the children, as doctors had instructed that Andrea never be left alone with them. In that 1-hour window, Andrea filled the bathtub with water, and one by one she drowned her 5 children. She started with the younger ones, Paul, Luke, John. She carried each small body to the master bedroom, laid them on the bed, and covered them gently with a sheet. She placed baby Mary in the crook of John's arm because, she later explained, John had always been a good big brother, and she wanted him to protect his little sister in the afterlife. Then she went for Noah, the eldest. Noah walked in, saw Mary floating in the tub, and asked his mother what was wrong. When he realized what was happening, the 7-year-old turned and ran. Andrea chased him through the house, caught him, and dragged him back to the bathroom. She held his head under the water as he struggled and told her he was sorry. When it was over, she left Noah in the tub beside Mary's body and called 911. Then she called Rusty. She told him to come home. When he asked why, she said simply, "It's time." When police arrived, Andrea met them at the door. Her hair was wet, her clothes were soaked. She was calm, almost vacant, as if something inside her had been unplugged. She told the officers what she had done in a flat, steady voice. She explained that she had been a bad mother, that Satan was within her, and that by killing her children while they were still innocent and young, she was sending them to heaven before he could corrupt them any further. She believed that when the state of Texas executed her for the crime, Satan would die with her, and her sacrifice would be complete. The nation reacted with horror and a kind of agonized confusion. How could a mother do this? Andrea Yates was not a monster by any conventional definition. She had no criminal record, no history of violence, no substance abuse issues. She had been a valedictorian, a competitive swimmer, a nurse. She had been, by every account, a loving and attentive mother who adored her children. What she also was, and what the system around her failed to adequately address, was profoundly, desperately, dangerously mentally ill. At her first trial in 2002, Andrea was found guilty of capital murder. The prosecution's star witness, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz, testified that Andrea had gotten the idea from an episode of Law and Order in which a woman drowned her children and was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The problem was that no such episode ever existed. Dietz had fabricated the detail, and when this was discovered, Andrea's conviction was overturned on appeal. At her retrial in 2006, a jury found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a state psychiatric hospital in Kerrville, Texas, where she remains to this day. She has repeatedly declined opportunities for release hearings, reportedly believing she deserves to stay where she is. Rusty Yates eventually divorced Andrea, remarried, and started a new family. He has said publicly that he does not blame Andrea for what happened, only the broken mental health system that failed her and the children she loved enough to believe she was saving. If Andrea Yates represents the catastrophic failure of a mind broken by illness, the next case is something altogether more chilling, because there was no illness, no psychosis, and no delusion to explain what happened. Only selfishness of a kind so absolute it defies comprehension. In the summer of 2018, Chris and Shanann Watts were living in a 5-bedroom home on Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado, a quiet suburb north of Denver. To anyone scrolling through Shanann's prolific social media presence, they were the picture of a happy young family. Shanann, who was 34, posted constantly about her life, her husband, and their 2 young daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. She sold health products for a multi-level marketing company called Lavelle and used Facebook Live to document everything from the girls' first days of school to date nights with Chris. She was outgoing, energetic, and deeply invested in projecting the image of a family that had it all figured out. Chris, meanwhile, was the quiet one. 33 years old, he worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum. Friends and family described him as gentle, reserved, and devoted to his daughters. He was the kind of dad who changed diapers without being asked and sat on the floor playing with his girls for hours. He was not, by any outward measure, a man anyone would suspect of being capable of violence. But behind the social media filters and the smiling family portraits, things were unraveling. The Wattses had filed for bankruptcy in 2015, claiming nearly $450,000 in debt against a combined income of roughly $100,000. They were living well beyond their means, and the financial strain was constant. More critically, in the summer of 2018, Chris had begun an affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. He told Nicole he was in the process of getting a divorce. He hadn't even broached the subject with Shanann. As the summer wore on, Chris grew colder and more distant. Shanann noticed. In text messages to friends, she expressed worry that he was pulling away, that something had changed. She was 15 weeks pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy they had already named Nico. On August 12, 2018, Shanann returned home from a business trip at approximately 1:48 in the morning. Her friend Nicole Atkinson, who had driven her from the airport, watched her go inside. It was the last time anyone other than Chris would see Shanann alive. In the hours that followed, Chris Watts strangled his pregnant wife in their bed. He later claimed there was an argument about separation, but his accounts shifted repeatedly and were riddled with lies. What is known is that he loaded Shanann's body into the back seat of his pickup truck and his 2 daughters, still alive, into the same vehicle. A neighbor's security camera captured footage of Chris backing the truck into his garage in the pre-dawn darkness and later pulling away. He drove approximately 45 minutes to a remote Anadarko oil work site in Weld County. There, he buried Shanann in a shallow grave near 2 large crude oil storage tanks. Then, according to his own eventual confession, he smothered Bella and Celeste with a blanket. 4-year-old Bella, in what is perhaps the most devastating detail of the entire case, reportedly looked up at her father and asked him to stop, pleading for her life as he took it from her. Chris then forced the bodies of his tiny daughters through 8-inch diameter openings at the tops of the oil storage tanks, submerging them in crude oil. He drove home, went to work, and when Shanann's friend called, worried because Shanann was not responding to calls and had missed a doctor's appointment, Chris acted concerned. He spoke to the Frederick police officers who arrived at his home for a welfare check, letting them inside willingly. They found Shanann's phone, her purse, her wallet, and her medication all sitting in the house. Her favorite shoes were by the door. Nothing indicated she had packed for any kind of trip. Chris told officers that Shanann had gone to a friend's house with the girls, but he couldn't say which friend. His story was thin, and it was about to get thinner. The next day, with Shanann and the girls still missing, Chris Watts went on local television. He stood in front of cameras with the practiced expression of a worried husband and stared into the lens, telling reporters he just wanted his family back and that not knowing if they were safe was tearing him apart. But investigators were already suspicious. A neighbor named Nathan Trinastich had offered his home security footage to police, and what it showed was damning. The camera had captured Chris in the pre-dawn hours of August 13th, backing his truck into the garage and later driving away, and no one else was seen leaving the house that day. Shanann had come home at 1:48 in the morning and had never left. Chris watched the footage alongside the officers, and his expression, or rather, his lack of one, told them everything they needed to know. His phone records showed constant communication with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker he had not mentioned to investigators. And when he was brought in for a polygraph test on August 15th, his father Ronnie at his side, he failed it spectacularly. FBI agent Tammy Lee and Colorado Bureau of Investigation agent Graham Coder confronted him with the results. Within hours, Chris Watts confessed to killing Shanann, though he initially spun an elaborate lie, claiming that she had murdered the girls and that he killed her in a retaliatory rage. Investigators saw through this immediately. His story didn't match the evidence, and his demeanor was that of a man who was calculating, not grieving. The bodies were recovered from the Anadarko oil work site. Shanann was found buried face down in a shallow grave, wrapped in a bedsheet that matched linens recovered from the trash at the Watts home. Bella and Celeste were pulled from the crude oil tanks. The discovery shattered whatever remained of the illusion Chris Watts had been constructing. On November 6th, 2018, in an unexpected move, he pled guilty to all 9 charges in a deal that took the death penalty off the table, a concession made at the request of Shanann's family, who said they did not want another killing to result from this tragedy. At his sentencing on November 19th, Shanann's family delivered gut-wrenching victim impact statements, while Chris sat with his head bowed, staring at the table. He was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy, and 36 years for tampering with deceased bodies. Then, in a 5-hour follow-up interview conducted in prison in February of 2019, Watts finally told the full truth. He described how he had strangled Shanann in their bed, how the girls had woken up and seen him carrying their mother's body, how he had driven for nearly an hour with the living children in the back seat and their dead mother on the floor of the truck, and how, at the oil site, he had smothered them one at a time. 4-year-old Bella, in what is perhaps the most devastating detail of the entire case, reportedly looked up at her father and asked him to stop, pleading for her life as he took it from her. He currently sits in a maximum security prison in Waupun, Wisconsin, where he is held under close watch protocol. What haunts people most about the Chris Watts case is not just the brutality of what he did, but the absolute ordinariness of who he was. There was no history of violence, no criminal record, no diagnosed mental illness. He was, by every visible measure, a normal guy, a doting father, a quiet husband. And then, in the span of a few dark hours, he erased his entire family to be with another woman. If the Watts case exposes the horror of what lies beneath a carefully curated surface, the story of Susan Smith reveals how far a person will go to construct a lie so monstrous that an entire nation believed it before the truth came crashing down. On the evening of October 25, 1994, in the small town of Union, South Carolina, 23-year-old Susan Smith drove to the edge of John D. Long Lake with her two young sons buckled into their car seats in the back of her burgundy 1990 Mazda Protege. 3-year-old Michael sat behind the driver's seat. 14-month-old Alexander was beside him. Susan got out of the car, released the parking brake, and watched as the vehicle rolled down a boat ramp and into the dark water. The car floated for approximately 6 minutes before sinking beneath the surface, carrying her two children with it. They were still strapped in when they drowned. Within hours, Susan Smith ran to a nearby house, hysterical and screaming, and told the homeowner that she had been carjacked. She described a black man who had forced her out of the vehicle at a stoplight and driven away with her son still inside. The story set off a massive manhunt. Police, the FBI, and hundreds of volunteers fanned out across the state. Susan appeared on national television, tears streaming down her face, clutching her estranged husband David's hand and pleading for the safe return of her boys. She spoke directly into the cameras with a trembling voice, telling Michael and Alexander that she loved them and begging their supposed kidnapper to bring them home safely. The country was riveted, vigils were held, flyers were plastered across multiple states, tips flooded in. Black men across the region were pulled over by police searching for a suspect who didn't exist. But investigators were suspicious from the start. The intersection where Susan claimed the carjacking happened had a traffic light that would only turn red if another vehicle triggered the sensor, and Susan insisted there had been no other cars around. The details of her story didn't align with the physical evidence, and as the days passed, her behavior shifted in subtle ways that experienced detectives recognized. She seemed less interested in finding her children and more concerned with managing her own public image. On November 3rd, 1994, 9 days after the disappearance, Susan confessed. She told investigators that she had driven to the lake with the intention of taking her own life along with her children, but that at the last moment she had gotten out of the car and let it roll in with the boys still inside. The why behind Susan Smith's actions became the subject of intense public scrutiny and debate. She had been having an affair with Tom Findley, the son of the wealthy owner of the company where she worked. Findley had recently broken up with her, writing her a letter in which he told her he wasn't ready for the responsibility of being a stepfather. Prosecutors argued that Susan killed her sons because she believed they were the obstacle standing between her and the wealthy man she wanted to be with. It was, they said, an act of supreme selfishness disguised as desperation. Susan's defense team, led by the legendary attorney Judy Clark, who would go on to represent some of the most high-profile defendants in American history, including the Unabomber and the Boston Marathon bomber, painted a more complex and devastating picture. Susan's childhood had been a wasteland of trauma. Her biological father had taken his own life when she was just 6 years old, and the grief and instability that followed marked every aspect of her young life. When her mother remarried a man named Beverly Russell, who was a prominent figure in the local Republican Party and the Christian Coalition, it appeared that things might stabilize. But Russell had been molesting Susan since she was a teenager, a fact that he himself later publicly admitted. The abuse was known to some family members, and yet it continued. Susan had attempted suicide at the age of 13. As a teenager, she carried on a sexual relationship with a married man who worked at the same store as her. When he ended it, she tried to kill herself again. She was, her attorneys argued, a deeply damaged woman who had been failed by every adult in her life and who had never received the mental health treatment she so desperately needed. The abuse she endured was not an excuse for murder, but it was context that explained how a human being could reach such a catastrophic breaking point. The trial drew enormous media coverage, rivaling even the O.J. Simpson case that was happening simultaneously. The judge in Susan's case refused to allow cameras in the courtroom, in part because he was troubled by what television was doing to the Simpson proceedings. The prosecution, led by Tommy Pope, asked for the death penalty. Pope argued that Susan had made a calculated choice to end her children's lives for her own romantic convenience. He pointed to the 9 days of deception, the tears that were real enough to fool a nation, and the false accusation that had set off a racially charged manhunt that resulted in innocent black men being stopped and questioned across the region. The jury convicted Susan Smith of murder, but chose not to sentence her to death. She received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She became eligible for parole in November of 2024, at which point a hearing was held. Her ex-husband David, along with 14 other witnesses, appeared before the board to oppose her release. Susan, appearing via video from prison, wept and told the board she knew what she had done was horrible and that she would give anything to go back and change it. The board unanimously denied her parole. She remains incarcerated at the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina, and will not be eligible for another hearing until 2026. While Susan Smith's crime was premeditated and calculated, the next story involves a moment so sudden, so volcanic, that it compressed an entire life's worth of rage into a matter of seconds. On the night of July 24th, 2002, Clara Harris was a 44-year-old dentist living in the affluent Houston suburb of Friendswood, Texas. She and her husband David, an orthodontist, had built an empire together. They owned 6 dental practices that pulled in hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. They lived in a $500,000 home in a gated community. They had twin 3-year-old sons, Brian and Bradley, and appeared to be living the kind of life most people only dream about. Clara, who had been born in Columbia, had once been named Mrs. Columbia Houston. She was beautiful, successful, and, by all accounts, completely devoted to her husband. But David had been unfaithful. He had started an affair with his former receptionist, a woman named Gail Bridges. When Clara found out, she was devastated, but determined to fight for her marriage. She threw herself into a self-improvement program, getting cosmetic procedures, joining a gym, and trying desperately to win David back. She also hired a private detective agency, Blue Moon Investigations, to monitor David's movements. On the evening of July 24th, the agency called Clara with news that David was not where he said he was. He was at the Nassau Bay Hilton, the very same hotel where he and Clara had been married on Valentine's Day 10 years earlier, and he was there with Gail Bridges. Clara raced to the hotel with David's 16-year-old daughter Lindsay, who was visiting from Ohio in the passenger seat of her silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class. she found David and Gail in the lobby. A violent confrontation ensued. Clara screamed, slapped Gail, and ripped her blouse. Hotel staff intervened and steered Clara back toward her car. David and Gail walked to Gail's SUV in another part of the parking lot, and that is when something inside Clara Harris broke completely. She gunned the engine of the Mercedes and aimed it straight at them. The first impact sent David flying 25 feet across the asphalt. Clara circled around, crossing 2 grassy medians, and ran over David's crumpled body a second time. Then a third. Lindsay, who was screaming in the passenger seat, reportedly tried to open the door and escape. The private investigator Clara had hired happened to have a video camera running, and the entire incident was captured on tape. When Clara finally stopped the car, she got out, walked to where David lay broken on the pavement, cradled him in her arms, and begged him to breathe. He died hours later at the hospital. Clara was arrested and charged with murder. At her trial in February 2003, which fell on what would have been their 11th wedding anniversary, she testified that she had been trying to hit Gail's SUV, not David, and that in the chaos and emotion of the moment, she didn't realize she had run over him. The jury didn't buy it. Lindsay testified that before the attack, Clara had told her she was going to hit David. The jury convicted Clara of murder, but found that she had acted in sudden passion, which under Texas law reduced the sentencing range. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. She served 15 before being released on parole in 2018 at the age of 60. As of 2023, her parole has ended, and she is a free woman. She is reportedly penniless, can no longer practice dentistry due to her criminal record, and lives with a friend. From a parking lot in Houston to the windswept Oregon coast, our next story takes us to a family whose picture-perfect exterior concealed a web of lies so intricate that when it finally collapsed, it took 4 innocent lives with it. In the late 1990s, Christian Longo appeared to be everything a young father should be. He was handsome, charming, and seemingly devoted to his wife Mary Jane and their 3 children, 4-year-old Zachary, 3-year-old Sadie, and 2-year-old Madison. To their church community and their circle of friends, the Longos were an attractive, faithful young family. Christian and Mary Jane had married in 1993 when he was 19 and she was 26, and they were active members of their local Jehovah's Witness congregation in Michigan. Christian dressed well, spoke confidently, and gave the impression of a man who was doing well for himself. But it was all a lie. Christian Longo was not a successful businessman. He was a compulsive fraud artist who had been forging checks, stealing construction equipment, and running small-time scams for years. When creditors or the law got too close, he would uproot his family and move them to a new state, always with a story about a fresh start and a better opportunity. From Michigan, they went to Ohio, and from Ohio, they moved to Oregon, each time leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills and burned bridges. Mary Jane, who had been disfellowshipped from the Jehovah's Witnesses after Christian was caught cheating on her, was increasingly isolated from her family and any support system she might have relied on. In Oregon, the Longos settled in Newport, a quiet coastal town. Christian got a job at a local Starbucks while telling people he was actually wealthy from an internet venture and was only working there because he liked the coffee. The rent wasn't being paid, the kids weren't eating enough, and the family was about to be evicted again. On the night of December 16th, 2001, Christian Longo stood on the balcony of their apartment looking out over the water and made a decision. He went inside and strangled Mary Jane to death. Then he strangled 2-year-old Madison. He stuffed both of their bodies into suitcases, weighed the luggage down with dumbbells, and loaded them into the trunk of his car. He then picked up his 2 other sleeping children, buckled them into the back seat, and drove to a bridge over Lint Slough, an inlet of the Alsea River. There, he tied pillowcases full of rocks to their ankles and threw Zachary and Sadie, still alive, off the bridge into the cold water below. The suitcases containing Mary Jane and Madison went into Yaquina Bay near their apartment, and then Christian Longo went on vacation. Using a stolen credit card, he booked a flight to Cancun, Mexico. He checked into a seaside resort, hit the nightclubs, drank heavily, romanced a German tourist, and assumed the identity of a real person, Michael Finkel, a writer who had recently been fired from the New York Times Magazine. For 2 weeks, Longo lived it up in paradise while his children's bodies drifted in the freezing waters of coastal Oregon. He was so committed to the charade that he could speak knowledgeably about Finkel's published stories, and he charmed everyone he met with the easy confidence of a man without a care in the world. He told fellow travelers about his adventures as a journalist, made plans for future trips, and showed no visible sign that he had just committed the most unspeakable act a father can commit. Back in Oregon, the bodies were being found. Zachary's body was discovered first, floating in the Alsea River on December 19th. A fisherman spotted the small form near a marina in Waldport. The boy was about 4 years old, wearing only his underwear, with no obvious injuries. Police initially assumed he had wandered away from his parents and accidentally drowned. Then divers found Sadie's body nearby, still tethered to the bottom of the slough, by a pillowcase full of rocks tied around her ankle. A similar weighted pillowcase was found near where Zachary had surfaced, suggesting it had been attached to his ankle before coming loose. 8 days later, the suitcases containing Mary Jane and Madison were recovered from Yaquina Bay near the family's apartment. The discovery transformed what had been a missing persons case into the largest criminal investigation in Lincoln County history. The FBI placed Christian Longo on their 10 most wanted list, right alongside Osama bin Laden. He was captured in January 2002 near Cancun without incident. At his trial, he claimed that Mary Jane had killed Zachary and Sadie in a fit of rage over their finances, and that he had killed her and Madison in response. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before convicting him on all counts. He was sentenced to death, though Oregon's moratorium on executions kept him alive. In 2011, Longo finally admitted to killing his entire family. His death sentence was later commuted to life without parole in 2022 by Oregon Governor Kate Brown. The real Michael Finkel, upon learning that a wanted murderer had been impersonating him, became obsessed with the case. He visited Longo in prison, and the two developed a strange, unsettling relationship that Finkel chronicled in his book True Story, which was later adapted into a film starring Jonah Hill and James Franco. From the coast of Oregon, we moved to the desert of Arizona, where early on the morning of April 10th, 2001, residents of a quiet Scottsdale neighborhood were jolted awake by a thunderous explosion. A house on North 74th Place had erupted into flames so violently that neighbors came running out in their pajamas, some with garden hoses already in hand, trying to contain the blaze before firefighters arrived. When the fire crews finally extinguished the inferno, they found 3 bodies in the wreckage. Mary Fisher, 38 years old, lay in what had been her bed. She had been shot in the head and her throat had been slashed. Her 2 children, 12-year-old Brittany and 10-year-old Bobby, were also found in their beds. Both of their throats had been cut ear to ear as they slept. Investigators quickly determined that a gas line in the home had been deliberately severed and that the house had been rigged to explode, likely with the help of a candle set near the leak as a delayed ignition source. It was a calculated, cold-blooded attempt to destroy the evidence. The fourth member of the household, Robert William Fisher, was nowhere to be found. Robert Fisher was a 40-year-old surgical catheter technician who worked at a Mayo Clinic hospital in Scottsdale. He was a former Navy enlistee who had attempted to become a Navy SEAL, but had washed out of the program. He was an avid hunter and outdoorsman, the kind of guy who spent weekends in the Arizona backcountry and could survive comfortably in the wild. He was also, beneath the surface, a deeply troubled and controlling man. Friends and neighbors described a marriage that was far from happy. Robert and Mary fought about money and intimacy. Robert had admitted to an affair a couple of years earlier, and though they had reconciled, the marriage remained tense and volatile. A neighbor reported hearing a loud argument coming from the Fisher home at around 10 that evening on April 9th, roughly 10 hours before the explosion. Police theorized the murders occurred between 9:30 and 10:15 that night. At 10:42 that night, an ATM camera captured Robert Fisher withdrawing $280 from a machine near his home. Mary's Toyota 4Runner was visible in the background. Later investigation, including testimony from previously uncontacted witnesses, confirmed that the 4Runner was still parked at the Fisher home as late as 5:30 in the morning, meaning Fisher returned home after the ATM visit and likely remained at the house until shortly before the explosion, giving him only a few hours head start on police. 10 days after the explosion, a camper in a remote forest area near Young, Arizona, about 24 miles southeast of Payson, spotted Mary's 4Runner hidden among the trees. The SUV had been wiped clean. The family dog, a loyal hound named Blue, was found alive, guarding the vehicle. But of Robert Fisher, there was no trace. Search teams, including SWAT units and cave exploration specialists, scoured the rugged terrain of the Tonto National Forest. They found nothing. The area bordered the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, a sovereign nation that authorities could not easily enter to search. Robert Fisher was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list in 2002, and a reward of $100,000 was offered for information leading to his arrest. He remained on the list for nearly 20 years before being removed in 2021, not because the case was solved, but because the extensive publicity had failed to generate any credible leads. To this day, no one knows whether Robert Fisher is alive or dead. Some investigators believe he fled to another country in the chaotic days before September 11, 2001, when travel security was far less stringent. Others believe he retreated into the wilderness and either took his own life or succumbed to the elements. His former friends and family are divided. His sister has said she cannot believe he would go this long without contacting anyone, suggesting he may no longer be alive. Detectives who worked the case are split as well. What is not in dispute is the horror of what happened inside that house on North 74th Place, and the fact that a man who coached his kids' sports teams and attended church every Sunday is believed to have cut their throats while they slept, and then vanished like smoke. Our final story takes us back decades, to a morning that would echo through American history and help ignite a phenomenon that the country is still struggling to understand. On the morning of Monday, January 29, 1979, children at Grover Cleveland Elementary School in the San Carlos neighborhood of San Diego, California, were lining up outside the school's front gates, waiting for their principal, 53-year-old Burton Ragg, to unlock them and let them in for the day. It was a routine morning. Parents were dropping off kids. The crossing guard was at her post. The January air was cool but clear. Across the street from the school, inside a small, run-down house littered with empty whiskey bottles and dirty clothes, 16-year-old Brenda Spencer sat by a window with a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle balanced across the sill. The gun had been a Christmas present from her father, Wallace, a gift that baffled everyone who knew the family. When someone had asked Brenda what she wanted for Christmas, she had said she wanted a radio. Wallace bought her the rifle instead. Brenda's life, up to that point, had been defined by neglect and dysfunction. Her parents divorced when she was in elementary school after her mother discovered that Wallace had been carrying on affairs with multiple women. Brenda and her siblings went to live with their father in that cramped house across from the school. Neighbors described the interior as filthy, with Brenda and her father sharing a single mattress on the floor. There was very little food in the house, and Brenda had virtually no supervision. She was frequently truant, had been caught stealing and vandalizing property, and was known to abuse drugs and alcohol despite being barely old enough to drive. She suffered from epilepsy and was supposed to be taking medication for it, but compliance was sporadic at best. Before the shooting, there had been warning signs that, in hindsight, seem impossible to have missed. Brenda told a probation officer she wanted to shoot a police officer. A psychological evaluation had flagged her as depressed and potentially suicidal. She had told classmates the week before the shooting that she was going to do something big to get on television. No one took her seriously. No one intervened. And when her father gave her a semi-automatic rifle for Christmas instead of the radio she had asked for, neighbors were baffled. When someone later asked Wallace why he had given his troubled, unstable teenage daughter a weapon, he reportedly had no meaningful answer. In the months following the shooting, in a detail so disturbing it seems almost fictional, one of Brenda's first cellmates, a 17-year-old girl, was released from custody and moved in with Wallace Spencer. She eventually married him, had a daughter with him, and then fled the household. Just after 8:30 that Monday morning, Brenda opened fire. She squeezed off 36 rounds into the crowd of children and adults gathered outside the gates. Principal Burton Ragg was hit as he tried to shield students from the gunfire. He died at the scene. Custodian Mike Suchar rushed out to help the wounded and was shot and killed as well. 8 children and a police officer, Robert Robb, were wounded. 9-year-old Cam Miller took a bullet through his back that passed within centimeters of his heart before exiting through his chest. He survived, but the trauma would follow him for the rest of his life. After firing her last round, Brenda retreated into the house and barricaded herself inside. The police surrounded the property and called in negotiators. During the standoff, a reporter from the San Diego Evening Tribune named Steve Wiegand was calling random phone numbers in the neighborhood looking for witnesses. One of the numbers he dialed happened to be the Spencer house. Brenda answered. Wiegand, not yet realizing he was talking to the shooter, asked if she knew anything about the incident. In a calm, flat voice, Brenda told him she was the one who had done it. When Wiegand asked her why, she gave the answer that would become one of the most infamous quotes in American criminal history. She said she just did it for the fun of it. She said she didn't like Mondays and that this livened up the day. She also told him she had shot a police officer and wanted to shoot more, that she was having too much fun to surrender. The standoff lasted over 6 hours. Brenda reportedly warned negotiators that she was still armed and threatened to come out shooting. Eventually, after being promised a meal from Burger King, she surrendered peacefully. She was charged as an adult, pled guilty to 2 counts of murder and assault with a deadly weapon, and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She has been denied parole 7 times, most recently in February of 2025, and is currently incarcerated at the California Institution for Women. She is not eligible for another hearing until 2028. The shooting at Grover Cleveland Elementary School is widely considered one of the first modern high-profile school shootings in the United States. San Diego County prosecutors have referred to Brenda Spencer as having played a significant role in starting the deadly pattern of mass school shootings that has plagued America in the decades since. In 2001, Spencer herself acknowledged the potential connection between her actions and the wave of school violence that followed, reportedly telling interviewers that with every school shooting, she feels partially responsible. The Irish rock band the Boomtown Rats, led by Bob Geldof, wrote a song about the shooting after Geldof read about Spencer's quote on a newswire at a college radio station in Atlanta. The song became a massive hit in the United Kingdom, spending 4 weeks at #1. Spencer reportedly wrote to Geldof afterward, saying she was glad she had done it because he made her famous, though Spencer has denied ever contacting him. What each of these stories shares is a shattering of the illusion that we can truly know another person. John List was a church-going accountant. Andrea Yates was a nurse turned stay-at-home mother. Chris Watts was a guy who posted happy family photos online. Susan Smith was a young mother who wept on national television. Clara Harris was a successful dentist. Christian Longo was a charming young father. Robert Fisher was a former Navy man and devoted churchgoer. Brenda Spencer was a 16-year-old girl with a rifle and a grudge against Monday mornings. None of them fit the profile of a monster until, one day, they did. These are the stories that keep us awake at night, not because they're fantastical, but because they're real, and because the people at the center of them were, in many ways, unremarkable right up until the moment they became unforgettable. If you found these stories as gripping and unsettling as we did, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us more than you know, and it means we can keep bringing you stories like these. Until next time, sleep well, and we'll see you in the next one.